I'm Lisa Mikkelsen, head of human capital at Flourish Ventures. We back entrepreneurs whose innovations help people achieve financial health and prosperity. At Flourish, we're laser focused on the well-being of our founders. Well-being includes resilience, work-life harmony, and mental health. We are striving to normalize the conversation about mental health between investors and entrepreneurs. Today, I'm thrilled to talk with Jamil Zaki. Jamil is a professor of psychology at Stanford University, studying social processes, including empathy, cooperation, and trust. His work focuses on training individuals, groups, and communities to empathize more effectively. Dr. Zaki has a BA in cognitive neuroscience and a PhD in psychology. He's published over 100 peer-reviewed articles and has written for numerous publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the Harvard Business Review. In 2019, he published his first book, The War for Kindness. Jamil, thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Lisa. It's a pleasure to join you.
Now, I've heard many definitions over the years. Help us understand, Jamil, what is empathy?
Yeah, thanks for starting here. I think it's so important to get definitions very clear in a discussion about empathy because a lot of people use this word in different ways, which generates a lot of confusion. So I think some of that confusion arises because, as scientists like me understand it, empathy actually isn't one thing at all. It's an umbrella term that describes multiple ways that we connect with other people's emotions, three in particular. So let's say, Lisa, that I jumped on this call and instead of being, as I am, thrilled to be talking with you, I was really upset and you could tell immediately that I was in anguish. Well, as you saw me, a bunch of things might happen inside you. First, you might start to feel upset yourself, vicariously catching my feelings. That self-other overlap is what we call emotional empathy. Second, you might start to wonder, what is going on with Jamil? Why is he so upset? And that detective work of trying to figure out what the world feels like to somebody else is what we would call cognitive empathy. And third, because I know you are a very caring person, you, Lisa, would probably say, well, gosh, maybe there's something I can do to help. You might feel a motivation to improve my well-being, which we would call compassion or empathic concern. And these three pieces of empathy, sharing what other people feel, trying to understand what they feel, and then having a motivation to help them, together make up the full range of human empathy.
That's fascinating. Just being able to break it into those three different buckets. I look forward to learning more about how we can apply that to some of the work that we're doing. But just to build on what you said, we often hear that empathy is a soft skill or it's something that's nice to have, but it doesn't really do much to impact the bottom line. In fact, some people go so far as to say that empathy is counterproductive to successful outcomes and efficiency. How would you respond to this?
Yeah, I love that question. And I love that challenge because I hear it a lot. I think that, this is a conversation. I know this series is one where you focus on mental health, resilience, and well-being. And I think that it's relatively clear to many people in leadership and investing and beyond that empathizing with somebody is a good way to bolster their mental health and ours, right? That when people feel connected, their morale improves and they generally are happier and less stressed. All of that is true. And I sometimes then see people say, well, okay, so I then have to choose. Do I try to make the people in my workplace, the people who are my colleagues or business partners, do I focus on making them happy and healthy, or do I focus on having a successful business? And I love that distinction because it's so clearly wrong that it's easy to break down. It turns out that work thrives, people do, in all sorts of different ways. So from the world of empathy science, there are decades of evidence now that demonstrate when leaders empathize with individuals in their companies, when workers feel as though their organization is empathic, it's not just that they feel better, it's also that they work more productively, they're more willing to take creative risks and innovate in their work, they're more willing to engage in citizenship behaviors, collaborating and helping their colleagues, and for lack of a better term, they're more likely to stay and not turn over from their jobs. So I think of, I know a lot of your audience are investors. And so we often think in terms of, well, what's the return on this investment? I think it's critical to understand that when we invest in empathy, we're not just investing in having a happier, healthier group of people who work in our organizations or who we partner with. We're also investing in having more efficient and effective work happen. And on the other hand, when we choose not to invest in empathy, we often get, returns on that as well, negative returns in the form of plummeting collaboration, productivity, and then high turnover, which of course cost enormous amounts of money at a bottom line level.
Well, I love the phrase that you just used, Jamil. Work thrives when people do. I could not agree more. As somebody whose passion is on the people side, you had me at that quote. So you're saying not only is it a nice to have, but it's actually quite critical for all the reasons that you mentioned: building trust, empowering people, risk taking, corporate citizenship. I mean, in venture and in startups, these are pretty important things. And the cost to not having trust, for instance, is pretty significant. So let me ask you this. It all sounds very important, of course, and I 1,000% agree with everything that you say. Now, isn't empathy something we all have as humans? Isn't that something that's part of our nature? How much of that is innate versus learned?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that there's this perception that a lot of who we are as human beings is built into us, hard coded into our genes, hardwired into our brains, that we're sort of unchanging, at least maybe after our 18th birthday, after we stop developing. But that, of course, turns out to be not true at all. There are genetic differences in empathy. Some people are born more empathic than others, but the best research that we have suggests that genetic component is maybe 30% of our ability to empathize, which leaves a super majority of empathy to change and grow or shrink along with our experiences. And there's tons of evidence, including from my own lab, that people's experiences do change how well and how much they can connect with others. Some experiences, toxic experiences in particular, can cause our empathy to weaken or atrophy. And other experiences can cause it to strengthen and grow like a muscle. And crucially, that means that through the right habits, we can build our empathy on purpose the same way that we would strengthen a muscle. My lab and I do all sorts of experiments and interventions where we build empathy in medical workers, in middle school students, in political partisans. And we often think of that work as building empathy gyms for people, places that they can go to work out their ability to care and understand when they want to.
This is all so encouraging to hear because it really feels like it's something that we can all improve. And I mean, let's face it, I think any of us can be improving this all the time. You mentioned the lab and building some habits. So what might be some specific habits that we can all build or practice in order to improve our capacity for empathy?
Oh my goodness. I'll try to keep this short. There's so many things to think about here.
Please give us the list.
One that I would start out with is our mindset. I think that simply believing that you can't change is a great recipe for not changing, because it disempowers us and makes us feel that, well, whatever my strengths and weaknesses are now, they'll be there forever. So there's very little motivation that people have to try and invest in themselves if they don't think there's any outcome that they're looking for at the end of that process. So I think embracing the changeability of deep parts of ourselves, including our empathy, is a key first step. The second thing that I would suggest is, again, and Lisa, this gets right to the word that you just used, habits. I think oftentimes when people think about changing themselves, they imagine enacting a grand gesture. Okay, I want to become more empathic. I'm going to spend my vacation building homes for Habitat for Humanity, or I'm going to donate a kidney to a stranger. I mean, I'm going to do something enormous that will really change my life forever. And those grand gestures are terrific. I'm not saying that people shouldn't do great big things for others. But change happens in the little things that we do every day that are a little bit different. So, one thing that I encourage people who want to build their empathy is to create time for it, not hours or weeks at a time, but minutes at a time, but every day. Even if that means putting a little reminder in your calendar each day to just spend 5 minutes doing something for somebody else, listening to them, helping them in the best way you can. A third thing that I would say is to focus on the questions that we ask as opposed to the things that we do. Empathy ultimately is about paying close attention to what reality feels like to another person. And oftentimes we think that we need to step in and save the day or do something really wonderful for somebody. But really, to quote a poet who I really like, attention is the sincerest form of love. So actually just paying close attention to others, asking good questions is a great habit to practice. And then the last thing that I'll say, Lisa, and I'm trying not to filibuster here, is that if you are in a position of leadership or influence, one of the most powerful things that you can do is reward people for their empathy to create a culture in which it's easier for people to express their most empathic selves.
Oh, yeah, that last point. I mean, this is the question that we always get asked about. If you want to build a certain culture, what do you do? Well, you have to reward, you have to acknowledge, you have to recognize those behaviors that are contributing to the culture. These are all really great ideas. I mean, I think they're totally doable. Nothing here is outside of one's control or budget or anything. The third one you mentioned, the questions that we ask, that seems very profound, and such a simple thing, yet we're not always thinking about that. I mean, coaches are masterful at this, right? Asking the right questions. What is the focus? So if we apply some of the, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I just wanted to build on that because
please.
One of the most famous techniques in empathy science, and that researchers used for decades, was perspective taking. Basically, put yourself in somebody else's shoes, right? This is a phrase that I hear all the time when I ask people to define empathy, which is, how would I feel if I was in your position? And that's a fine thing to do, but it definitely doesn't work all the time because it trades on assumptions that we are similar, right? I mean, if I wanted to figure out how comfortable your shoes were on you, the last thing I would do is put them on myself because they probably don't fit me, right? So my experience in your shoes won't tell me about your experience. And so oftentimes when people assume that, okay, let me see how I would feel in this person's situation. Okay, I bet I'm right. They actually don't end up any more correct than they would have if they hadn't done perspective taking at all. So what I encourage people to do instead is what's known as perspective getting. So instead of sort of assuming, okay, well, I would feel this way in your situation, asking people more like if you were a journalist or even a detective, right? Put yourself in that role and say, well, what information do I need to better understand this person's situation?
That is such an amazing nugget, perspective getting. And Jamil, I mean, I am guilty of this 100%, saying, oh, just, walk in somebody else's shoes, see what it's like in somebody else's shoes. How many times do we say that? And it's actually missing the point. So I'm really glad that you put that out there. And, in the context of the investor and entrepreneur or founder relationship, what would be some advice that you could give to investors specifically who want to build strong relationships and see that strong performance? Like you mentioned, there's really a connection there.
Yeah, I think this is such a great question. And, a few things come to mind. The first is to really align, especially early and often, on core values that drive the founder that you're working with and that join you together. I think that the more that you can stay plugged in to why somebody is doing what they're doing, the more that you can understand their motivation and help them achieve those deep goals that are probably ultimately the source of success anyways. A second thing that I would say is to focus on what I would call underbearing attentiveness. Now, I usually talk about this in terms of leaders and organizations and their employees, but I think that this also might relate to the funder-founder relationship, which is that oftentimes we feel that trusting somebody with a job in our organization or with our money if we're an investor is sort of puts us in a weak position because we now are vulnerable to them. And so people often try to hedge against that weakness by controlling somebody, right? By controlling their employee or by exerting control over somebody who they've invested in. The issue is that that can really backfire because people reciprocate trust and they retaliate against mistrust, right? So it turns out that there's a lot of research that finds that when, and a lot of this again is done with employees in organizations, but I think it translates that when employees feel like their boss is looking over their shoulder, they're much less invested in that working relationship and in their jobs in general. And they're much more likely to try to cut corners when whenever their boss looks away. In other words, by forcing people to do the bare minimum, leaders make it much more likely that people will do only the bare minimum because they've sort of broken that trusting relationship. And I think that the same might be true of founders, right? If they feel as though a funder is really breathing down their neck, they might withhold information. They might not feel as though they can be open about what's going on in their company because they don't feel like there's a trusting relationship there. So if you're a funder or an investor, one way to sort of prevent that outcome is to instead trust loudly, to say, hey, I'm here for you when you need me. How can I support you? Asking those questions, but then also saying, I think that you've got this. So I'm going to step back and you just let me know when you need me. Otherwise, we'll check in a week or 2 weeks. But other than that, you're on your own. That type of underbearingness as opposed to overbearingness, I think can show somebody that, hey, in my eyes, you're going to do a great job. You're capable of this. And when people see that, instead of stepping down and away from the relationship, they step up. They try to be the people who we hope they will be.
This is a fantastic distinction. And I want to say that term again, just for our viewers, underbearing attentiveness, which almost seems a bit like an oxymoron at first, but I see what you're saying here. It's like you're really turning the head on this notion of kind of micromanagement, right? Yeah. Or just being, this isn't to say that you want to be breathing down somebody's neck, but it also means you're not just totally hands off. You're still engaged. You're still actively participating, but it's kind of the way that you do it and in a trust-based style. I love that.
Yeah, it's almost I guess the difference between a boss and a mentor. Even the term boss has an almost pejorative connotation. This is somebody who's there to force you to do things, right? And right. A mentor, by contrast, is somebody who's there to grow you into the person you want to be. And that requires great care and attention to what a person's values are and what their strengths are and how those strengths can be developed to meet their values, but not a lot of like a forcing function to just get this person to behave in the way that a boss wants to.
Right. Which is typically how the initial funding relationship starts out. Somebody goes to an investor for that mentorship, for that guidance, not for the person who's going to tell them what to do. So nobody goes into it thinking that that's part of the relationship. But how can we equip our founders to look out for that? So let's say, I'm an entrepreneur, I am seeking funding. This is one of the most difficult times in a founder's life, is having to raise capital, and going through that process, you're evaluating so many different things. How would you suggest, from an empathy perspective, that founders look at potential investors? What might be some red flags to look out for? What might be some questions to ask, or ways that, as a founder, you can be sure you've got the right person on your team?
It's a great question. And maybe in addition to red flags, I might focus on some green flags that founders could look for as well, right? Which are really, we've been talking about from the investor perspective and just from a human perspective, what can we do to practice our empathy? Well, as an interlocutor, as a partner with somebody, you can try to detect whether they're doing those things or not. One thing that I think is quite relevant to this conversation is what's known as the power paradox. This is a term in psychology because it turns out that when we are empathic, when we can connect with other people, that increases the likelihood that we will achieve positions of leadership, influence, power, and status, because all of those things draw from our connection with other people and the coalitions we form. But ironically, simply achieving those outcomes, becoming a powerful, influential, and high status person can often strip away the empathy that got us there in the first place. So even making people feel powerful for a moment in an experiment makes it less likely that they'll take the perspective of somebody else, that they'll ask questions, even makes it less likely that they'll express compassion for the suffering of others. It even makes it less likely that they'll imitate other people's facial expressions and postures. So I think that one thing that I would look out for if I was a founder seeking funding is I would look for whether a potential investor is acting as though we are in an imbalanced power relationship where they have power over me. What would some signs of that be? Well, they would ask fewer questions about, again, my motives and values and focus more on what this investment will bring to them. They might, in general, seem as though they're not attentive to my perspective or needs in the relationship. And they might focus a lot on guardrails and assurances that they can have, as opposed to showing trust in me, right? And obviously the green flags here are the opposite of that. A funder or a potential funder who's asking a lot about core values, who's asking good questions in general about me and my work, and who seems as though they are open to a trusting relationship where they invest and then are willing to let go and have me do what I need to do for the company to succeed.
Those are excellent things to look out for. And it sounds like, essentially what you're saying is this investor investing in people? Are they investing in the humans behind the, amazing product or company that's being built? But do they really care about this person who's going to be in relationship with them for a long time? Because let's face it, these are not short life cycles. I mean, the venture cycle is pretty long, right? So you're kind of in it for the long haul. This whole power paradox you mentioned, is that something that you've studied in your lab, or where do you have more information about that? I think that's really fascinating in this particular area.
Yeah, we've studied it a little bit, but the greatest research on this topic, I think, comes from Dacher Keltner, who's a friend of mine and a professor at UC Berkeley. And he's got tons of data, both showing that people who have lots of power or privilege or status in general tend to show lower levels of empathy. And again, also showing that my favorite work of his is making people feel powerful in an experimental context by like having them win a game, for instance, and showing that as you're grandstanding and really enjoying your victory, you suddenly show a precipitous drop in how much empathy you experience. And again, I think that this is important, not just as a sad note on power, because I think it's not true that power sort of damages our brain in a way that fundamentally makes us incapable of empathy. Rather, I think it's incredibly important for people who have the good fortune of having power and privilege and status to just be aware that, okay, when I'm in that type of relationship, I might not default to paying tons of attention to other people. And some of that is totally understandable. I mean, I'll give you an example. I run a lab. It's sort of like you can think of it almost as an academic small business. I have 10 people who work full-time for me. And oftentimes they'll write me an email where it's very clear that they've spent a lot of time and attention. It's a 5-paragraph essay making an argument for something that they want to do in an experiment. And I'll write back all lowercase Greta, which is just great that I misspelled because I didn't have any time to focus on that, on what they were saying, right? So oftentimes it's just a bandwidth issue, but it's not always a bandwidth issue. And I think that when we are with people who we have power over, it's incredibly important to tend that relationship, to realize that the things that we say and do will have outsized importance and impact on them. And that if we say something that's hurtful or wrong, or just plain misunderstand them, they're probably not that likely to correct us because they might be scared to do so. So people in power often end up wrong and unaware that they're wrong, which is a sort of form of double jeopardy.
Right? No one's going to tell them that they're wrong. I mean, it's such a great responsibility, right? To have this kind of power or position. Um, Maybe just one other thought there, which is adds to the irony, is I think you have a lot of situations of investors who were former founders. They've been through that journey before too. They've created businesses. They've been on the other side of the table, so to speak. I would just assume that would build more empathy, right? For having been there, having done that.
You would, but you might be wrong. I mean, the evidence here is mixed. So there are certainly cases in which having an experience increases our empathy for other people who have had that experience. That's especially true of trauma. People who have been through war, for instance, or natural disasters. It's almost like an antenna pops out of your head and you suddenly receive stronger signal from other people who have experienced similar things. But that's not always true for experiences that people choose. I'll give you one example. Medical residents work 100-hour weeks, often enormously sleep deprived, their mental health pretty bad. And most people hearing that situation would have lots of empathy for a medical resident. You know who doesn't? People who have been through medical residency, because there's this sense that, hey, I survived it, so you can survive it.
Yes.
And so I think that, there could be funders who previously were, startup founders themselves. And you could, if you want to, use that experience to tap into empathy for the founders you're working with. You shouldn't assume that their experience is similar to yours, but it can be a great conduit to understand them. But also, if you're in that position, you should be wary of a kind of jaded, sort of toughen up attitude that people often bring if they've been through something that they now observe somebody else going through.
Wow, like a sort of almost pay your dues kind of, I paid my dues, now it's your turn.
Yes, exactly.
Now, Jamil, another question for you, kind of on the other end of the spectrum. Is it possible to be too empathetic? And I'll share, as an HR professional, this was something that was talked about a lot during the pandemic, was this kind of, empathetic distress, or if you're, constantly having to care for people, what's the other side to too much empathy? Is that possible?
Oh, yeah, this is a huge issue. I'm actually writing an article for the Harvard Business Review about this now. And yeah, I think that the idea of over empathizing, compassion fatigue, it's often called, is very old. And for a long time, it was focused on in the domain of healthcare workers, so nurses, social workers, physicians. They're drinking from this fire hose of human misery. The people who they're interacting with are many of them having the worst day of their life, and they do this over and over again. And that chronic exposure to other people's pain can really damage our own mental health. And I think during the pandemic, honestly, a lot of us who manage people were almost like healthcare workers in a way, managing people's suffering on a day-to-day basis, week in and week out for years. So I think that there was a greater attention to this idea of empathy or compassion fatigue. I think that generally speaking, in organizations, and especially if you're a person in power, more empathy tends to be quite beneficial to you and the people you work with. But it's really critical to watch out for signs of compassion fatigue. And those include just general exhaustion, cynicism, and a kind of loss of meaning, almost a sense of depersonalization, where you kind of can't care anymore. And that can not just happen with the people in your job, it can also happen with your family. There can be these reverberating effects into the rest of your life. Now, if you're experiencing that, there's a few things that you can do. The first is to remember that empathy for ourselves is critically important. A lot of us have stereotyped self-compassion as selfish or lazy. It's the opposite. When people experience self-compassion, when they're kind to themselves, they actually bounce back from difficulties and failures more quickly. They're more resilient. And so I think that it's really important to remember that that type of self-compassion is good for us, good for our accomplishments, but it's also critical to being there for other people. You know, when you get on a plane, they say, okay, if the cabin depressurizes, oxygen masks will fall from the ceiling. What's the next line that they say? Put on your mask before helping
That's right.
anybody else, because you're of no use to somebody else if you are out of oxygen. And I think that's also true of emotion, right? So I think that caring for ourselves is not selfish. Actually, it's critical to being there for others in a sustainable way. The second and last thing that I would say for around compassion fatigue is that this gets back to, Lisa, the definitions that we started with, which were that there are different types of empathy. It turns
Right.
out that those different types of empathy are different in their effects on fatigue and burnout. Remember, I told you about emotional empathy, where if I was upset, you would become upset yourself, that sort of vicarious sharing of what other people feel. Turns out that that type of empathy is a huge risk factor for burnout. So, medical students, for instance, who are high in emotional empathy are much more likely to burn out during their training. But I also told you about this other piece of empathy, compassion or care for other people's well being. And strangely enough, it turns out that that type of empathy not only isn't a risk factor for fatigue, it's a protective factor against it. Why? Because when we feel compassion and care for other people, that connects us to the value of what we're doing, the meaning of why we're there for them in the first place. So there are ways, including meditation techniques, but there are also other ways to try to tune our empathy, not just turning it up or down, but tuning it towards compassion and away from vicarious sharing of what other people are feeling. And I think that if you're with somebody who's in distress, especially chronically in distress, it's critical when we can to say, okay, I'm here for this person as much as I can be, but that doesn't mean that I need to feel exactly what they're feeling at all times. In fact, that might not be the most helpful thing for them either.
Wow. So it sounds like there's a lot of different ways to look at this, but what sounds the most effective is this kind of compassion, this form of compassion where you're not absorbing the emotions of somebody else, but you're actually there and present and listening and asking the questions, right? Having the
Yes, yes.
practicing some of the other tips that you gave us earlier. Um, is there anything else that you think, Jamil, our viewers, whether they're founders, entrepreneurs, investors, might want to be thinking about in terms of building their own individual compassion or empathy capacity?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've covered a lot of great ground here. I mean, I guess if I could just reinforce a couple of points, it would be one, I hope that people can leave this conversation having a sense of empowerment. You know, we're all optimizing so much these days, whether it's the type of
Right.
calories we consume or our sleep or, fitness. Um, but I think we less often realize that we can also build and pay the same regular, precise, rigorous attention to who we are at an emotional level, and that we can actually evolve ourselves emotionally towards our values and goals. So I want people to really realize that, hey, the only thing that we can't do is stop changing, right? The ship is sailing of who we are. And even though we can't stop it, we can steer it. And then I think the second thing that I would really want to reemphasize is that trying to use that empowerment to build empathy is not a matter of becoming a softer, squishier person who gives up their power and just lets other people walk all over them. Empathy is a practice of precision, of really connecting and understanding what another person's world is like. And that precision is vital to anything that we want to do together. Any collaborative endeavor trades on our ability to understand what other people are going through, what drives them, and what their needs are. So I would think of empathy as a skill, but not just a skill in making people feel better, although it is, but also a skill in precisely working together.
Well, Jamil, I'm counting on you to develop the wearable, the first wearable that comes out, the empathy wearable.
Oh my
So we
goodness.
can be tracking our empathy. I have taken away so many great nuggets from this conversation. I'm just going to throw out a few quotes. Work thrives when people do. Yes. Building habits, super encouraging. It's not one big monster activity. It's little habits over time. Think atomic habits.
Mm-hmm.
Perspective getting instead of perspective taking. Love that. Underbearing attentiveness. Again, amazing. Trust loudly and power paradox. Okay, these are all, I could spend an hour talking to you on each of these topics, but this has been really fascinating and really helpful for me, hopefully for the rest of our viewers as well. I so appreciate your time today, Jamil. Thank you for being with Flourish today.
Thanks, Lisa. This has been a real pleasure.
And thanks for everybody who's watching. If you have any questions regarding today's discussion, you can always email us at events@flourishventures.com. Let us know what resonates. Let us know what you'd like to hear more of, and we'll keep it coming. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.